Hello, Vaughn. End of another always interesting week in BC politics. Why don't we start with the Premier's announcement yesterday on, again, in response to the tariffs out of the U.S. What has he ordered his government to do?
Yeah, the Premier is stepping up the pushback on the Trump tariffs. So he announced yesterday that he sent out a directive. This is not an optional directive. All government ministries, crown corporations, and agencies are directed to, where they can, cancel supply contracts with the Americans. So he said that ranges for everything from subscriptions for information to all kinds of supply contracts. Don't travel to the U.S., review it all, and as he says, where it is possible to replace the American supplier with a Canadian supplier, do it. And the only limitation that he mentioned yesterday was, well, where there's no equivalent Canadian supplier, or he said where it would be very expensive. He said the government is trying to save money, so if the penalty for canceling or the premium for the Canadian supplier is large, in the millions of dollars, the government wouldn't do that.
Right. Do we have any sense of how much money we're talking about here?
You know, we don't, because, first of all, he said it'll depend on the cost. But the other thing is, the government just asked a little while ago for all of these agencies and ministries to make an inventory of how many contracts they had. You know, really interesting answer for me, a reporter said, well, why haven't we always done this, had a Canadian preference? And he said, because we signed a treaty with the Americans where we agreed we would treat their suppliers on a level playing field with Canadians. That's the deal we had with them. So right. Trump has torn up that agreement effectively and trampled it. So BC isn't bound by it anymore. But for years, we've been treating American suppliers level playing field like Canadians. And so we, first of all, need to go out and make an inventory of how many of these deals we have.
Right. And the benefit of doing that, I guess, was that our businesses would have had the same consideration from American companies.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we had a free trade agreement with the Americans, right, which, as the Premier pointed out yesterday, Trump himself negotiated, and which he called a victory at the time in his first term, and he now calls it a scam and a ripoff. So, you know, we're going back on that. He's changed the rules on us. So the province is, well, looking at, is there a way to substitute Canadian suppliers? Also look at foreign suppliers. Are there Europeans, for example, that could provide the service, because we're not in a free trade agreement with the Americans anymore?
Right. Well, one area where we are pulling back our dollars is in Bellingham, as
yes,
far as the clinic. We were sending patients. How many have we, remind people, how many patients have gone down there for what type of services?
1,107. So 2 years ago, the New Democrats announced that we had a significant backlog in cancer treatment in British Columbia, and they were going to do something which was fairly controversial for the NDP. They had signed contracts with 2 clinics in Bellingham to provide radiation treatment for British Columbians, and British Columbians would be sent down there, all expenses paid. The province was going to pay for their travel, their accommodation, and for travel and accommodation and meals for a caregiver. So that was the deal. The province said it was going to be more expensive, but it was going to reduce the wait times for radiation treatment in BC. Well, that was 2 years ago. And this week they announced the contracts are coming to an end in May. And that's the end of it. Interesting, not nearly as many people took the government up on the offer as they expected. They budgeted for 5,000 people over 2 years and put up $80 million into the budget for that. Only 1,107 actually did it. Many British Columbians who were given the offer said nope. They were prepared to wait in British Columbia rather than go to the U.S. And some of the people that were put on the list didn't qualify either here or over there. So anyway, experiment's over. Province says the wait times are down to acceptable levels. So there's a national standard for radiation treatment. You're supposed to get it within 4 weeks of diagnosis. And the province says 93% of BC's cancer patients are now getting the treatment within 4 weeks. So there's no need for the program anymore.
And with the removal of this safety valve, if you will, what have they put in place to ensure that wait times don't simply start increasing again?
Well, I think that's something we're going to be monitoring. They say they've hired more oncologists and built up the system, and they believe that they can maintain this standard. They're at 93%, and you have to be at 90%. But I think we'll be monitoring that. It's interesting. They said this is not connected to the Trump tariff issue. That's not why they haven't canceled those contracts. They've simply not renewed them because they don't need them. But look, I think it's a pretty good bet that we'll be watching this one closely, as will the doctors in the system, as will patients. We may hear from patients who say, well, I've been waiting a hell of a lot longer than 4 weeks. Why am I not getting the treatment? I think that's the sort of issue we'll be raising and watching in the weeks and months ahead.
Right. And that doesn't include the wait time, though, that you have to see an oncologist, right? That's just from the diagnosis point. So I know it's complicated.
But that's one of the things we do with our system here, which is we count from diagnosis, not from how long you spend waiting to get the diagnosis. So that's also the case here. Now, that's the case with the national standard.
Yes.
We were down at 69% of patients getting treatment within 4 weeks. So they've got it, by their stats, up to 93%. So that is an improvement.
Well, and that's interesting. And again, if only 1,000 people took advantage of the opportunity to go south, that does suggest that they've made other changes that have facilitated the decline, because that alone wouldn't have resulted in such a change.
It would, Harold, you're right, but it would also be interesting to have a really independent assessment of this, which is really to ask this question: are Canadians so supportive of the healthcare system that they're willing to wait for care rather than jump the queue into the US? Because the American system is very heavily funded if you can afford it, and it has a lot of unused capacity in it. So we could reduce our waiting lists by contracting out on any number of issues. Our governments have been reluctant to do that. This experiment suggests that you could do it without undermining support for the Canadian system, and the take-up might not be as great as you imagine. But I like the idea myself that you do have the American system sitting there as a safety valve. And if the government is willing to pay the bills, it's not just a safety valve for those who are willing to cross the border and pay the bills, but the government itself could pay the bills to keep its waiting lists within manageable limits.
I can just hear Dr. Brian Day and others saying, though, why would we do that when we have perfectly good clinics here? We could keep the dollars and the people in Canada.
I think the answer to that is, with the American system sitting there idling at the curb and available, why would we insist on building all the way out to the worst possible scenario? Why not fund our system to a reasonable level and use the American system once in a while to get the waiting lists back within manageable levels? That's just me. I think that makes more economic sense. I also think that wouldn't undermine support for the Canadian system. It would just be what you said, a safety valve when you've got an actual crisis.
All right. Well, we could talk about healthcare all day, but why don't we move on to some, instead of money out, some money in terms of LNG? And you've got such a long and acute mind for these things. Where have the New Democrats gone on LNG?
I think they've moved much more supportive of LNG development. And I think for a reason. The big LNG terminal in Kitimat that's been under construction for a while is 95% complete. They will start sending LNG out in LNG tankers mid-summer. And these shipments are incredibly valuable. They say that one tanker loaded with LNG is worth $150 to $220 million. So this is a lucrative business for British Columbia. Very expensive project, privately funded. And I toured this facility last year, Harold, and when I toured it, they said there's two trains, is what they call them, to produce LNG. They take natural gas, they freeze it to 169 degrees below zero, and they liquefy it and load it onto tankers. So they have two trains there. They'll be shipping 14 million metric tons of LNG a year out of the terminal, but they have two sites ready to go to double production. So the question has been, phase two, what'll it take to go ahead? Energy Minister Adrian Dix said this week, they can go ahead with the second phase of the development when they choose to. The owners of the terminal, Shell and 4 international partners, already have the approval necessary to double production. It's just up to them to make a final investment decision. And the way the New Democrats are talking about it, Harold, I think they would welcome that going ahead as soon as Shell wants to do it. Revenue is going to flow into British Columbia. And Dick said something interesting. He said, it was planned some time ago, and the Horgan government approved the project in 2018. He said it couldn't come along at a better time because everyone in Canada is now talking about diversifying our markets. Right now, our natural gas goes to the US. That's it for a customer for British Columbia. We start shipping LNG out of Kitimat midsummer. It's going across the Pacific. We've got another whole bunch of customers. We've diversified. And as Dick said, couldn't have come at a better time for British Columbia and for the country.
You understand this better than almost anyone. How do you do this with the current electrical grid? Like, do they have enough power?
No.
No.
Okay. The way they make the natural gas at LNG Canada in Kitimat is they have gas turbines that generate the power to lower the temperature and compress the gas into liquefied form. So they burn natural gas to make liquefied natural gas. And the plant was approved on that basis way back in 2015, federal provincial permitting. And they did it because at that time, there was no obvious way to get that much electricity, which in BC would be clean and green because it comes from hydro. There was no way to get that much electricity into Kitimat, and we still don't have that much electricity going into Kitimat. So what the government has said is for expansion, until we can deliver that much electricity to Kitimat, it's not reasonable to ask the company to wait when they could expand now. So if they expand, decision expected next year by Shell and its partners. If they expand, they'll be running the whole thing with gas turbines until such time as we have a power line with electricity and enough electricity going all the way out to Kitimat. That's some years away, would be my estimation.
And the revenue sounds great. What does it do to this government's Clean BC plan?
Well, this project was exempted. It predates the plan. And that's another issue, federal government as well. They approved this all back in 2015. So it is, the first phase is included in the plan, but the second phase was approved without regard for the plan. However, Adrian Dix said something this week about all that too. He said, look, if you want to build a new LNG terminal in British Columbia, and there are proposals to do so, you will have to produce a plan showing how you will manage the emissions down to net zero, except if you've tried to line up a supply of electricity to power it and you haven't been able to get one. So again, he says it isn't fair to an investor who's tried and hasn't got the electricity because BC Hydro isn't generating enough power yet to do that. A number that popped out this week, the second phase of LNG Canada would need about 600 megawatts of electricity to replace the natural gas turbines. Well, 600 megawatts of electricity is more than half the capacity of Site C, which is coming online. So again, that's not realistic because BC Hydro wants Site C for us to electrify our vehicle fleets and to get our pulp mills to switch to electricity and a whole bunch of things. So to take more than half the output of Site C and put it into one LNG project, the government doesn't think that's realistic either. So I would say what we've seen is, the NDP in opposition, well, of course, the NDP in opposition opposed Site C too, and they're very critical of LNG development. In government, they realize it's a route to heavy investment in British Columbia, and now it's also a route to diversify our markets for natural resources to countries other than the Americans.
And of course, reconciliation. It's a big part of that.
That's true. Right? That's true. Yeah, you're quite right, Harold. The tankers that leave LNG Canada loaded with natural gas and our product to go to Asia, those are escorted in and out of Kitimat by a fleet of tugs, electric tugs, that are co-owned by the local First Nation, the Haisla, and C-SPAN. So that's a job creation thing for Indigenous nation there in Kitimat. A number of nations along the route have a benefit sharing agreement to share in the profit from the carrying of all that gas.
Right. Well, I just a short anecdote. I was chatting with an elder from the Haisla some time ago, and he was thrilled about what you talked about, the pilot boats, because his grandson, a member of the Haisla Nation, was training to be a tugboat crew member, and it meant that he would be staying in the community and not moving away the way so many had before him, and that he was going to have him there.
That's a really important aspect of what we're trying to do with resource development in the province. Many of the Indigenous communities in the province are remote and rural, and there isn't an awful lot of jobs there or things to keep the young people there. So where we've been able to do something, and Kitimat's a very good example, it's helped stabilize those communities in a way that it just wasn't imaginable if they were going to have to depend on hunting and fishing and trapping, traditional way of life.
All right. Thanks again, Vaughn, for this week. We'll see you.
Okay, Harold, we'll talk again.